Hey everyone, Stephen Jonathan here, and this is City of Truth Conversations. Today, I am joined by Casey Chalk, whose voice is growing in the public square, and with good reason. Casey is a senior contributor at New Oxford Review and The Federalist. He holds a BA in history and an MA in teaching from the University of Virginia, and a master's degree in theology from the Notre Dame Graduate School of Theology at Christendom College. He lives in his native Northern Virginia town with his wife and 4 children. Casey, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. You wrote an excellent article entitled Liberty, Religion, and Woke Progressivism. It's an article I think everyone should read. In fact, I'm going to post it along with this interview. So I wanted to ask you a few questions about that and hopefully have you explain to the audience what it is you're really getting at in this article. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. Happy to do it.
Great, great. Why don't we begin with a few definitions? First of all, do you think you can articulate a good definition of what it means to be woke?
Sure. So to be woke is to be awake, right? It's just kind of a play on that word. And it's to be awake regarding all the various alleged racial, gender, and sexual injustices that are inflicted upon various communities by what are termed racist and patriarchal power structures. So people who adhere to woke ideology believe that these various oppressive power structures need to be identified and then dismantled.
Wow, that was excellent and concise. Okay, to add to that just a little bit, can you talk just for a minute about what is progressivism?
Sure. So it's a general cultural trend. It's informed by a philosophy called positivism, which was founded by a French sociologist, Auguste Comte, in the 19th century. It asserts that humanity is on an inexorable movement towards greater scientific, cultural progress and enlightenment.
Okay, excellent. So is it an artifact of materialism, would you say?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes. In the sense that it views, it doesn't have room for the transcendent, and it thinks that humans in and of themselves, without regard to any kind of transcendent help, can, realize their own perfection.
Okay. So it's a purely secular movement, so to speak.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. Although certainly it's hijacked a number of different religious movements in America and in the West more generally.
Right. And we're going to get to that in a moment. Is it necessary now to kind of put those two words together and say, there's a term woke progressivism? I mean, you use it in the title of your article. Do you think there's a need to expound on that a little bit, or these two together pretty much make sense?
Yeah. It's basically just put the two ideas together, right? So people who believe that the dismantling of all those misogynistic, racist, patriarchal power structures is part of what's going to bring about that perfect future human utopia.
Excellent. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I would like to just reference one line you bring up sort of in the beginning of the article that I think is really important. You write, and I quote, "There has always been a tension between preserving individual freedom and the coercive demands of the state." I think this is really important to understand in the history of the United States of America, where our founding fathers had a conception of freedom and of the demands of the state. Can you expand a little bit on how that plays out in today's culture?
Sure. So if you're going to have a functioning state, at some level, it has to be coercive. So this is because the state is going to perform all manner of public functions that exercise a certain level of coercion over its citizens, right? So think taxes, laws that restrict various behaviors, possibly conscription in times of war, etc. Libertarians really bristle at any perceived infringements on their liberty. But to live in any kind of political society, we must necessarily have some level of coercion. So the point isn't really whether or not the state should be coercive, it kind of has to be, but how coercive it's going to be, and what kinds of guards, whether they're philosophical or legal, that should exist to limit the state from unjustly coercing its citizens and preserving their liberty. And this becomes an especially difficult problem when two citizens or groups of citizens claim that the other is in some respect coercing them or limiting their liberty, right? So on what principles is the state going to intervene to determine whose liberties trump the others? So for example, this is one of the things I talk about in my article, does religious belief trump sexual or gender identity, right? These are two foundational conceptions of the human person, right? Are we religious beings who are oriented towards a transcendent end, or are we primarily determined by our sexual preferences or self-identified gender.
Yeah, that's a very key question to answer, even in relation to liberty or personal freedom. But moving on from that, you make the assertion, and I think this is so important, you make the assertion that woke progressivism is a religion. And can you describe for us, how is it a religion?
Sure. So woke progressivism, like any religion, has its own dogmas. So, for example, the primacy of racial identity or sexual libertinism. It has its own conception of sin. One of the most prominent being this idea of white privilege, that there are certain people in the culture by virtue of their race and social stat, or even not even their social stats, even a poor white person in some respects is more privileged than other people in society. It has its own soteriology and eschatology. So, for example, the dismantling of racist power structures, racial reparations, and those who refuse to conform to these various doctrines and dogmas are maligned as heretics. So, fearing cancellation, the latter then have to employ ritual-like penitential language in order to seek mercy, right? And we see this constantly with celebrities and athletes when people drum up old Twitter posts that they had published when they were 18 years old, and they said something that can be conceived as racist or sexist or misogynist, whatever. And then they go through this very public penitential rite in order to ask forgiveness for their sins.
Right. And this seems to be snowballing. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. Well, in part, I think because wokeness continues to expand in terms of what is considered expected behavior, and then also what is considered heretical, right? What's worthy of condemnation.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. You mentioned their dogmas, and it's clear that those are so out in the open in public. Do you notice that their dogmas, their statements, and their own personal actions, that they hold some inherent contradictions?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of examples. One might be, who counts as a legitimate victim is constantly shifting and expanding, right? Yet if everyone is capable of claiming some kind of victim status, then who exactly is left to be the victimizer, right? So, for example, I talk, white males are oftentimes construed as the victimizers. Well, yeah, but if you're a white male who identifies as a woman, or I don't know, a white male who identifies as a Latino, which is something that's happened. We've seen in the news. There was a professor who was a white male, but he identified as Black for years and made a lot of money off of it and got a lot of academic praise for that, right? So you can sort of play yourself in a certain way so that even though you should be a victimizer according to the woke ideology, you can become a victim. Yeah, and that is contradicting.
Right. And as well, I've also noticed, have you seen that they have one standard for the victims and one standard for the victimizers, however arbitrary that might be?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, two completely different standards. Well, as you move through the article, you bring up this phrase that Scott Hahn and McGinley brought up, where they say that in this woke progressivism, there is no neutrality, even though I think they make the claim to be neutral. The movement claims to be the arbiter of all truth, it seems. Can you elaborate just a little bit on how they claim to be neutral, but when in fact there can't be a neutral in this case?
Yeah. So one of the fundamental tenets of classical liberalism, as has been passed down to us by the founders as they were interpreting political philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu, is the state should be indifferent when it comes to religious belief, right? So this is often called indifferentism. When it's applied to established religious institutions, it's called disestablishmentarianism. Yeah, the problem with this claim is that all people, and for that matter, all individual Americans in our attendant diverse social and political organizations, make universal claims about truth, justice, morality that they desire to make normative in American society. So many proponents of wokeism would like to see religious institutions coerced into accepting the former's own beliefs regarding sexuality and gender, for example. So Hahn and McGinley argue the question isn't whether society will be based in religious principles, but rather which principles will be reflected and supported and which will be ignored and suppressed.
Yeah, that's an excellent statement. Do you believe that most woke progressives believe they are or are not religious themselves?
I don't think that they view themselves as being religious. I think it's because they view themselves as basically just promoting what is true, what is acceptable scientific, sociological opinion. So because they want to be on the side of objective science-based truth. Of course, when philosophical truth or biological facts don't work in their favor, so for example, in regards to transgenderism, they'll claim that philosophy or science is itself a manifestation of patriarchal power structures, which is a clever rhetorical move.
Very clever. And that kind of brings up, you've talked about the whole time, I think, but I did want to ask, how is it specifically that the woke progressives weaponize their agenda?
Yeah, so they use all the cultural and political levers of power at their disposal. So media exposés and censure, the media exposes and censures all those who don't conform to woke standards. Academic institutions will block unwoke scholars from getting into the academy, or in cases like Paul Griffiths at Duke, a very prominent religious scholar, they'll push him out, right? He was forced to resign because of his refusal to engage in some of this more radical racial ideology. So the state is used to sideline, ostracize, or punish those who get in the way. And whether they be cake bakers, Catholic adoption agencies, or even religious institutions, right? They went after Karen Pence, former Vice President Pence's wife, when she was teaching at an evangelical school in my native Northern Virginia. I actually knew a lot of the people that went to that school. I know one of the head pastors there, right? So the Washington Post did a big expose, for example, where there was an alleged case of racism against a Black female student there. Turns out that there was absolutely no credibility to it. The girl herself eventually said, "Yeah, I just made all this stuff up because it seems like you get a lot of popularity if you make a claim about some sort of racist event that happened." But it was interesting to see how much the Washington Post went after this evangelical school, obviously because of what it teaches, particularly about sexuality, transgenderism, that sort of thing.
Right. Wow. Devastating. One final question before I ask for recommendations from you, but I think the world can have the sense that as we watch all these things unfold in the media, that we're watching from home and we're kind of safe. Do you think anybody is safe from the destructive outcomes of this agenda?
No, it's a pretty dehumanizing and reductionist understanding of the human person. If we're reduced most fundamentally to our race, our gender, our sexual desires, then we're not really being encouraged to pursue our ultimate and most important and transcendent ends, namely God. I think it also causes two different forms of psychological distress. On the one hand, those who are told they're victims, they feed off of outrage and bitterness, right? Which is just not good for the soul. It's also not good for social relationships. Those who are told that they're part of the victimizer class, meanwhile, suffer anxiety, then this feeling of being that they're constantly perpetuating various forms of oppressive behavior, microaggressions, etc. I know a woman who works HR in a major firm in DC, and she told me after the very unfortunate death of George Floyd last summer in 2020 that she was inundated not from Black employees who were concerned about racism, but all of these liberal white employees who were basically just terrified that they were in some way causing some sort of problem in the firm. It's also especially damaging for the young, who are most vulnerable to the messaging that plays out on their emotions and their undeveloped frontal lobes. I was just talking with earlier today with comedian Jim Brewer, who I don't know if you're familiar, your audience is familiar with. And one of his recent comedic bits is about how his daughter came back from college, calling him and his wife racists and talking about how there's like 16 or 20 different genders. So, I mean, it's funny, but it's also sort of terrifying that this is what a lot of young people are being exposed to on campuses. Right. And certainly anyone who's a Christian, woke progressivism represents a direct assault on Christian orthodoxies because it transfers one's fundamental identity to from being in God to being in race, sex, gender, whatever.
Right. Devastating. So I wonder if you've had any time to think about what advice you would give to folks of goodwill. What is it do you think that we ought to do to respond to this, if anything?
Well, I think some of that's going to depend on your state in life. If you're a parent with young children, I know it's not always possible based on financial situations, but if you can avoid sending your kids to public schools, I think that's definitely one thing. That's something that my wife and I, we have 4 kids, and we homeschool our kids. But like, I understand sometimes that's not possible. But that certainly will help a lot. I think if you do have to send your kids to public school, I think you need to be really on top of the kinds of material that they're being exposed to. and raising the alarm when you're seeing stuff that, that violates your own way of parenting your children.
Right. Yeah. And that's tip of the iceberg, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, certainly there's plenty of great literature out there that people can familiarize themselves to better understand the philosophy of it. A lot of what I'm relying on Scott Hahn, who's a great Catholic scholar, and Brandon McGinley, who's a pretty prominent Catholic speaker. But there's a lot of other fantastic writers out there. Some who write for a more general audience, others who are more academic. But people like Patrick Deneen, Rajard Legutko, Pierre Manen, Jordan Peterson at a more popular level. These are people who I think are making really strong, effective arguments against, the woke progressivist ideal.
Yes. Excellent. And would you recommend that we as citizens should also speak up, or should we just be careful?
Well, I think again, it would probably depend on your state in life.
Right.
If you're working as in a place where speaking up might end up getting you fired, well, you got to think about being able to provide for your family and whatnot. But yeah, for those who are in a position to do so, who don't think there's going to be severe professional liabilities for doing so, yeah, I think it's supremely important that we resist it in any way we can.
Right. Agreed. I want to keep this short. I want to wrap this up, and thank you so much for coming. But before we go, please tell us what you're working on and what's coming up next for you.
Sure. There's basically just always a constant churn with me. Like I mentioned, interviewing Jim Brewer. So I plan to have a piece out, hopefully with the Federalist or another publication, talking about his comedy routine. I would recommend people check him out. Apart from that, I'm doing something on the Hillbilly Thomists for the Abbeville Institute. Hillbilly Thomists are a fantastic group of Dominican brothers who do bluegrass music. Actually, one of the guys in there, Father Thomas Joseph White, he converted me to Catholicism about 10 years ago.
Wow.
He's a fantastic guy. Great music. So I definitely recommend checking out their album.
Yeah. I highly recommend it as well.
Yeah.
Amazing. And Father Thomas Joseph White, he's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Casey, thank you for coming on. I hope you come back and talk with us more next time you write an amazing article, which will be very soon, I'm sure. So
very much appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.